Morning, everyone. If you would be turning to Hosea 4, we'll start in verse 11. 11 through 14 is the discussion of Israel's idolatry. And then 15 through 19, a warning that is given to Judah. And so we'll see what we can glean from these thoughts this morning. All right, bow with me as we go to God in prayer. Father, we are so thankful and grateful for this first day of the week. Father, where we are able to come together and to study, encourage, enjoy one another's company, mindful of those that are sick. We ask your blessings to be upon them all. Mindful especially of the Hope family, and we continue to pray for them, the loss of Brother Ken. And Father, we ask you to comfort them in a way in which only you can. We thank you so much for the great promises that are ours in your word, for the hope that is set before us. And Father, we pray that we'll live our lives well pleasing to you, that we might be able to spend eternity with you forever someday. And it's in Christ's name we do pray. Amen. Hosea 4 verse 11, sorry. 4:11. Harlotry, wine, and a new wine, harlotry wine and new wine enslave the heart. My people ask counsel from their wooden idols, and their staff informs them. For the spirit of harlotry has caused them to stray, and they have played the harlot against their God. They offer sacrifices on the mountaintops and burn incense on the hills, under the oaks, poplars, and terebinths, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters commit harlotry, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they commit harlotry, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots, and offer sacrifices with a ritual harlot. Therefore people who do not understand will be trampled. All right, verses 11 through 14, God is identifying their idolatry. You can read other references where he is referring to their idolatry. If you go to chapter 8, verses 4 through 6, chapter 10 and verse number 1, these will be further references to their idolatry. And so now we see where he addresses them, and he says there are a variety of things they are doing, and we'll just note these very quickly. First, harlotry, wine, and new wine. Take away their understanding. When we think about these folks, they are worshiping idols. They were guilty of harlotry. Now, folks, there's two senses in which this can be considered and should be considered. Number one, spiritual harlotry. They've turned away from God, and they are now worshiping idols. Note here it says, my people ask counsel from their wooden idols. And I think that's kind of interesting wording. The people ask. They ask of their idols. We need counsel. Well, let's just say that this pew here is my idol. I'm going to bow down before it, and I'm going to ask it to counsel me. And in essence, when I get up and I walk away, whose counsel have I received? It's my own. And so that's the image that you get here. And so then he says the spirit of harlotry has caused them to stray, and they played the harlot against their God. So spiritually, they've turned away from God, and they've turned to idolatry. But more than that, now notice as you think about the fact that they are committing harlotry, now this is going to go to the physical where they're going to be, and it's not to get too overly graphic or anything, but folks, all of this stuff where it talks about they were under the poplars and the terebinths and all of these oak trees because the shade was good there. Folks, a lot of times this would turn into nothing more than just a big sexual orgy. And that's what it would become. And these people were doing this, and so then in 14 he says, now I'm not going to just punish your daughters or your wives. And that's the point of this. It's not that God's not going to punish them. The point is, I'm not going to punish your wives and your daughters alone, because the men were engaged in this every bit as much as the women. And so the point that he's making is, I'm not going to just punish them alone. For your men themselves, they're all engaged in this activity. So, in comparing their idolatry to harlotry, in verse number 12, he is talking about their idolatrous acts. And so we won't spend a whole lot of time on this because we understand some of the imagery that might be presented to us in these verses. And this is what God's people were involved in. Now I think we need to think about that for just a moment. This is what God's, now maybe I need to qualify this, God's professed people were doing. But in reality, were they God's people? No. And folks, notice this, because I want you to go back, and probably the key verse in this entire chapter is verse 6, because it talks about the fact that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Knowledge does what? Makes you aware. But it doesn't make you what? Wise, obey. It doesn't make you behave. It doesn't make you behave at all. And so he says, you are destroyed for a lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. Now, because you've rejected knowledge, I've what? I've rejected you. Now, look at the end of verse number 10. Your lack of knowledge, your refusal to have my knowledge, your willingness to forget me has caused you to cease obeying the Lord. Now, what does this turn into? Idolatrous actions on the part of the Jews. They're now going to be bowing down to their wooden images and all of that. And, you know, and today, and I think it was much more serious in so many ways during this day and time. But folks, when I think about this sort of thing today, I think about some of the things that people turn to. Y'all ever encountered anybody that did not start their day till they read their horoscope? Oftentimes it turned into a horror scope, but they're looking at their horoscope. They want to know what's happening. And so because I was born in the month of April, that makes me an Aries. Well, you know, so people look at this, and that dictates much of their life. That's what's guiding them. That's what's instructing them. You know, and so, you know, they really think that, okay, so an Aries and so should not marry because they're two opposite zodiac signs or whatever you call that. There's people that are guided by Ouija boards. And I thought about doing it a lot of times just to see what would happen. But on 31, as you're going between Athens and going down to Corsicana, there was a palm reader. And I started to stop in there hundreds of times, I guess, or maybe not that many, but several times, just to see what would they tell me. But then I'm afraid, No, not really. But anyway, but there's a lot of folks, and there'd be cars that would be stopped there. And I mean, and the oddest times that place is open. I mean, who would be reading Psalms at 8 o'clock at night? I mean, just stuff, but stuff like that is what, maybe not a majority, but folks, there's enough people that are interested in having their palms read that if Justin was interested in doing that, he would have what? A business. Making money. Yeah. And so we dismiss this as, oh, that's just foolishness. Well, it is. But there's a lot of people that made a ton of money off of what? Foolishness. So, as we think about this is some of the things I think about today. And, like I said, what Israel was doing is vastly more heinous than what this might be in our eyes. But in reality, if palm reading and all of those art things that people get involved in today, those types of things, if that's their God, then where are they? Are they separated from God? As much as Israel was. All right, somebody was, okay, Dale? Yeah. We don't realize how far the sin that carries. Yeah. Yep. That is true. And that's the point we need to be ever mindful of, and I've read it a lot of times on Facebook, and I think some of y'all probably have too, but it talks about if the church is an afterthought to grandparents, then it's a less thought to the children, and then to the grandchildren, it's like a non-factor at all. Well, there is a reality of that, that there are some things that are to be directly tied to some of this, and yet, as we think about what Israel was doing, and I think one of the greatest things about this is we see their rebellion, but as Dale brought up, because you have done this, then I'm going to forget whom? Your children. Now that forgetting is not that I don't know them or I don't see them, but this idea here of forgetting is the idea of blessing. Now, y'all just think about this. What had God done with Israel and for Israel when they were in good stead with Him? Had He blessed them? We talked about this in previous chapters here, and He talked about we're going to take this away, we're going to take this away, we're going to take away this, all these things. Well, these were things that Israel enjoyed simply because they were obedient and faithful to God. But then He says, I'm going to forget your children. In other words, they're not going to enjoy the same blessings that you and maybe their grandparents enjoyed, because I'm going to forget them because you have forgotten me. Justin?
So what was the Old Testament wrote for?
Our learning.
For our learning.
Yeah.
So what are we learning from this today? How do we apply this to what it's talking about? We talked about idols here a lot. But what is the idol that we do every day if we don't watch it? That is not a wooden image, not a metal image. It's anything we put before God.
Right.
So it could be work, it could be grandparents, it could be parents, it could be children, it could be activities. That takes us away from God. That becomes our idol.
And that's exactly right, because a simple definition is anything that moves God out of center, then that has in essence become an idol. That's true. Yeah. So these are all things that we see, even though as we're not doing what Israel did per se, in that we're doing the same actions, but the same results are happening. All right, Eric.
In Deuteronomy 17, the Lord told him, you're going to want a king because we want to be like all the other nations.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just their king. It was everything else about that nation they wanted to be like. With the idols, everything else, and put God on the back page. But like Justin was saying, how does that affect us today? If we put anything before God, then we're in the exact same boat they are.
Yep. And that's just about as simple as you can put it. All right. So now, Ben. Uh-oh.
If I was a really ardent idolater worshiper and carried it to the max, I was going to end up with something what God gave to the Levitical priesthood. But they're just like we are. They don't want to go through the effort. So you see them getting further away. Well, now they're doing it on the housetop. They're not putting nothing into it. So get back to what Justin was talking about. What does it mean to us today? Are we putting anything into it? Or are we just like they are? We're trying to get it. Now, I've never been a big opponent for the live stream and stuff. I understand people with homebound, that could be a good thing. But to me, I see it as an excuse why I stay home. I don't even have to leave the house. So are we not kind of facilitating that as well?
Yeah. And I mean, there's nothing inherently right or wrong about streaming live services and stuff. And as you stated, that can be very beneficial. It can be very helpful to those who are in need of it. But at the same time, I can't use it as a crutch. I can't use it as something to, I don't need to put the effort out to go and gather with the saints. And so there are things that we have to constantly be keeping in check. And that's where 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, where we are encouraged to examine your what? Yourself, to see if you be in the truth or not. So that's up to each individual, and it certainly was up to the nation of Israel. All right, Dale?
Well, I think one of the first, and I can't quote the scripture, but I don't know where it's at. It's talking about these wooden idols. You take a tree, and part of it would make an idol out of it, the rest of it would burn the fire.
Yeah.
So that, to me, that's the exact comparison of what we need to make today. What am I putting in place of God?
Yeah.
Service of God, my attention to His Word. What am I doing? Well, it's just like firewood. That's what it is. We're not going to be here that long.
Right.
We've got one step to go ahead.
Yep.
And anything that comes to us other than that goes us away.
Very true. All right, and if you look at, having looked at these things, now let's look at 15 through the end of the chapter, because now he moves from their idolatry to giving a warning. And remember a few weeks ago when I told you, as you read through the book of Hosea, you need to highlight those Israel is like a certain image. Well, this is the first one that we come across here in verse 16. And so now notice he says in verse 15 and following, though you, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend. Now do not come up to Gilgal, nor go to Beth-aven, nor swear an oath, saying, as the Lord lives. Now these two cities, Gilgal and Beth-aven, they were known as idolatrous centers of worship, and they were in the north. And so now they're not to be going to those places. But then notice the thrust that's given to Judah. At this point in time, historically, Judah is still faithful to God. They're still observing God. Now, I'm not going to say they didn't have their struggles as a nation. And you got to remember now, when we talk about in this book of Hosea, we talk about Israel, what area are we referencing? This is something we just need to keep in our mind. When we're talking about Israel, we're talking about the 10 tribes to the north. The background of all of this is you go back to 1 Kings chapter 12. There we have those two infamous people, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And what happens on that occasion? What's the kingdom do? It splits. Okay? Now if you go back and you track this historically, then as being brought up, they asked for a king, or Brother Eric brought it up. They asked for a king, and God gave them one. And so then we have Saul, and we have David, and we have Solomon. Now 1 Kings 12 is going to identify the death of Solomon. He dies. And so then we're going to have where there's a controversy now that starts between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And so then because of that, now we're going to have a split. And from that time on, historically, you'll study things where we have no longer a united kingdom, but we now have a divided kingdom. And we're going to have 10 tribes to the north, 2 to the south. Those 2 to the north are identified as Israel. The 2 to the south are referred to as Judah. Now, as we look here now, he says, though you, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend. God is warning and sending a warning to the nation of Judah. Do not follow the example of whom? Your kinsmen. Do not follow their example. So let not Judah offend. Do not come up to Gilgal or to Beth-aven. Don't come up to these places. They're places that are known for their idolatry. Don't come to these places. And then he says, and do not swear an oath, saying, as the Lord lives. Why? Because Israel is stubborn, like a stubborn calf. Now the Lord will let them forage like a lamb in open country. How safe is a lamb in open country? But notice, how is Israel? Like a stubborn calf. We used to have, when the kids were in FFA, we'd have show calves. And what's one of the things you got to do to that show calf? Work with it, break it, get it to where you can lead it and everything. But does that come easy? No. There's no telling how many hours we've spent with cattle with their heads, noses pointed up to the sky, you know, got a halter on them, and they're tied up to the fence. And anyway, and you're brushing them, and you're stroking them, and you're trying to take that wild out of them. And, you know, it's just part of the process. Some are way worse than others. Some break pretty easy. And but this is the image. They're like a stubborn calf. And so, you know, I've seen guys, we did this one time. I never was a fan of it, but we did it one time. But we tied a calf behind the tractor. And we pulled that thing about from here to the end of the auditorium, and then those feet went straight out like this, and we're just dragging that thing down the road. Well, I never was a big fan of that, but I don't know if it was that or if it was the other type of halter that we got and we put on it, and it had metal that went around right here, and that jawbone on that calf would get so sore you could just barely touch it, and boy, you had their attention. Well, all sorts of examples of all of that stuff as far as, trying to break a stubborn calf. But Israel is stubborn. What do y'all pick up? What image comes into y'all's mind when you read the word stubborn? Donkey. I'm not even. If y'all didn't see that, Mike went. So anyway, she's doing it back. Two-way street right here. But anyway, stubborn. Whenever I think of stubborn, I think of the story I heard of a kid that was told over and over and over again, sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down. Finally, the kid sat down, looked up, and he said, well, I want you to know, on the outside I'm sitting down, but on the inside I'm standing up. Stubborn. And that's what God is looking at at Israel. You're stubborn. And because of your stubbornness, now what's going to happen? Had God protected Israel? Yes. Over and over and over again. Now God says, because of your stubbornness, because of your refusal to obey me, because of your involvement in what? Idolatry. Now I'm going to let you forage as a lamb out here in the open. Folks, I want us to consider a thought. And I don't know how far we can take this today. I don't think we'll ever know. But has God built a hedge around us? Folks, that's one of the most encouraging statements that you'll find in the Bible, in my opinion. When you read the opening thoughts of the book of Job, what's the devil's charge against God? Yeah, that's why he obeys you, because you built a hedge around him. What does that hedge mean? Protection. Now, like I said, I think this is the point. Did Job know that? Yeah. Yeah. But folks, this is the point I want us to consider. Does the devil know that God has built a hedge around us today? Yeah. Yeah. But folks, this is the point, and Dale's absolutely right. Folks, this is the point. Job didn't know that. God did not come down to Job and say, hey, look, I built a hedge around you. Job had faith that led him to what? Trust in God. And the devil knew that. And so the devil says, well, no wonder he trusts you. You've built a hedge around him. And folks, God never denied that. God never said, no, I haven't. No, God said, yeah. But I tell you what I'll do. To prove how faithful Job is, you can do this. And he gave the devil leeway to make Job's life what? And I mean, it came down to the point, we know he lost his family, possessions, physical health just declined, and we see this miserable picture of Job out on the ash heap, and he's scraping himself with bits of pottery, and his friends come up, and he's so deformed by the physical shape that he's in that they really don't even recognize him. But then in Job 13:15, what does Job say? One of the most faith-infused passages in the entire Bible. Though he slay me. He being whom? God. Though he slay me, yet I will trust him. So as we think about ourselves today, and we think about the fact that God's now telling Israel, I'm going to let you just roam free out here in the open. I'm going to let you fend for yourself. I'm going to let you feed yourself. I'm going to let you do all of this, and you're going to be like a lamb out in the open. How long will a lamb last out in the open? Till the first predator comes along. And then what happens? They're just going to lay down and die. I mean, they're going to allow themselves to be killed. I don't know that there's a more defenseless animal in the entire world. There could be, but I don't know of one. That may be my ignorance. But the reality is God says, I'm letting you fend for yourselves, and you are absolutely what? Incapable of doing that. Now, he says Ephraim. Now, who is Ephraim? That's Israel. Ephraim is the largest tribe in Israel. And therefore, you'll find as you go through various instances of the Old Testament where Ephraim is used and is a synonym for Israel. So he says now that Ephraim is joined to idols. Now let him alone. Now their drink is rebellion. They commit harlotry continually. Her rulers dearly love dishonor. The wind has wrapped her up in its wings. They shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. And then he says, hear, O priests, take heed, O house of Israel. Chapter 5 and verse 1, the beginning of that chapter. So in chapter 4, 15 through 19, we have the warning that is given to Judah. Do not imitate whom? Your kinsman to the north. And so then as the chapter concludes, it concludes again by relating Israel's idolatry to drunkenness. The nation is drunken. They are intoxicated. They are playing the harlot. And their rulers, they love to have it so. Notice what their rulers dearly love in verse 18, the latter part of the verse, last part of the verse. What is it that their rulers truly love? Shame. My New King James says dishonor. Okay? That's what their rulers love. Well, what do you think their rulers are going to be promoting? Yeah. You know, we read that earlier that like people, like what? Priest in chapter 4, like people, like priest. And I stated then I didn't know which way that was, if that was a two-way street, if the people had such an influence on the priest that the priest just kind of fell in line, or if the priest went that way and sort of just guided the people. However we slice it, the nation of Israel were those that were engaged in full-blown idolatry and all the actions that went with it, and their rulers what? Love to have it so. What's the responsibility of a ruler? Okay? and to guide and to lead in a certain direction. And that's the job of a ruler. But now the rulers, they love dishonor. So they're going to be pushing and promoting dishonorable actions by the people, because that's what they love. That's what they want. And so as we think about this 4th chapter, he now is going to be talking about, the inhumanity that they showed to their fellow man by murdering, stealing, lying in the opening verses of this chapter. Then he turns to their idolatry and the practice that they were involved in, identifies Israel as a stubborn calf that refuses in so many ways, I guess, to be broken. And their leaders, they're just fine with it. We love it. We love this. Now, so then when we move into chapter 5, and we'll read these first 3 verses, and then we'll see what time we have left. He says, "Now hear this, O priest, take heed, O house of Israel. Give ear, O house of the king, for yours is the judgment, because you have been a snare to Mizpah, and a net spread on Tabor. The revolters are deeply involved in slaughter, though I rebuke them all. I know Ephraim and Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you commit harlotry. Israel is defiled." Let's go through verse 5. "They do not direct their deeds, turning toward their God. For the spirit of harlotry is in their midst, and they do not know the Lord. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Therefore Israel and Ephraim shall stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with them." Now, as I stated earlier, Judah had its difficulties. And largely that was attributed to the king. If the king was one that came in and, because Judah had its high places, it had its places of idolatrous worship. And so a lot of times the king would come in Judah, and he would do away with the practice. But what would he leave? The places where the idolatry was observed and practiced. He'd leave those. Well, those things were a constant reminder of what? This is what we could be doing. This is what we could be doing. It was a constant reminder and temptation to them. Well, that's the nation of Judah. Now, Israel or Ephraim, they were totally different. They seemed to be just fully engulfed in idolatry. And there wasn't a king that came along that said, let's stop this. Never. Judah did have those kings. There were 4 of them, as a matter of fact. Maybe we'll list them next time we come together in class. They had 4 good kings, really good kings that came through, and they would eradicate to some degree, and even some of them to a great degree, the idolatry that was being practiced. Ben, was your hand up?
If we're looking at the difference there between the 2 nations, and then look at the church, how God said elders are each local congregation, so we can see that not everybody goes astray when one group does.
Oh, yeah, you're right. And so not everybody in the nation of Israel would do that very thing, would go astray, but the majority, the major part of them would. And yet you would have that, and then even in Judah you had those that would refuse idolatry, but then there was the mindset of some that, no, we need to be doing this, we can do this. And so, yeah, there is that charge. So now in chapter 4, God had a case against Israel. He says, I'm bringing a charge against you. This is like a legal case. And so then in chapter 5, he begins to focus on the priest and their establishment of the illegal priesthood that came in 1 Kings chapter 12 that I referenced earlier, as Jeroboam, as they are now there, and Rehoboam is coming, and he's going to be the rightful king. Jeroboam comes and he says, hey, we need to slack up on some of this. Your dad was extremely harsh and cruel on us, so we need to slack this up. And so then Rehoboam, he goes and he gets his advisors, and they say, no, we're going to make things much, much worse. So then Jeroboam, he flees and takes the people, and he says, everyone to your tents. Everyone go to your homes. And then they're going to establish alternate places of worship, Dan and Bethel. They're going to establish an alternate priesthood. And so they're going to do a lot of things. A lot of inventions are being brought in by Jeroboam. And folks, I've said this to y'all for the, 30 plus years I've been here. How do we remember Jeroboam? What word? Jeroboam was a what? He was a jerk. He was a jerk. He had no right to the throne. And yet he comes in and he's powerful enough, he usurps his authority, and he gets the people to follow him, and he establishes these alternate places of worship. Well, what's the problem with that? You know, if we just had 1 Kings 12 and that's all we had, we might say, well, you know, I don't see that as being so bad. Alternate places of worship. Just think of the convenience. You know, because how long would it take you to go from the northern part above the Sea of Galilee down to Jerusalem to worship? How long would that journey be? Are you going to do it in a couple hours? A couple of days, maybe. So Jeroboam's smart enough. He says, if we don't do this, then they're just going to go back to Jerusalem. So he establishes alternate places of worship. And so then, once again, I ask the question, well, what's wrong with that? And folks, the simple answer is what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is being identified for us in the book of what? Hosea. That's the problem with that. And so, as they made that compromise, then what does that lead to? Further and further compromise. All right. We'll pick all this up again next week. Thank you all for your good comments this morning and your attention. Thank you.